welcome to Made Possible by Pop Culture, the podcast. Or maybe I should say welcome back, because this is season 2, and I do hope some of you at least have been with me from the beginning. But for anybody who's tuning in new, welcome. I'm always happy to have new people listening or watching if you see this on YouTube. Now, if you're a TV fan like me, you know season 2 always needs to be bigger and better. And that's exactly what I plan to give you. I'm your host and producer, Danielle Turchiano, and this means season 2 will have more episodes, different guests, and an expansive discussion around pop culture. We spent so much time in season 1 talking about TV. It's my favorite medium. It's where I made my money for so many years as an entertainment journalist. But pop culture is so much more, and we're going to get into that in season 2. Now, whether you have been here and need a refresher or are brand new and don't know why you're here at all, let me tell you what this podcast is. I bring on guests to talk about some influences in their lives. We go flashing back to the past, sometimes as young as their childhood, to talk about something in pop culture that greatly inspired them, influenced who they grew up to be as a person, or maybe even professionally. And then we come back to modern times and we look at what pop culture is doing for them today. For some of my guests, that'll be talking about something that they just genuinely love. But for some of them, it's going to be promoting a specific project that they worked on that they want you to love as much as they did. So without further ado, please help me welcome my very first guest of season 2. I apologize for that rhyme. That was not great. Maria Garcia. She's a journalist and a podcaster. You might know her from Anything for Selena. That podcast, she actually earned Apple Podcast Show of the Year in 2021, which is a big achievement. And she's followed it up with My DIVO. It's a podcast about Juan Gabriel, which just wrapped up its run. Now, Maria puts herself into these stories to showcase her love, her knowledge, and her investigation skills for these artists. So you're going to get a story unlike anything you've heard before, even if you already feel like you know a lot about both Selena and Wanga. Maria, I have to say, first and foremost, thank you for coming on this podcast, because as my longer time followers know, I don't know a lot about music. And I feel like I've learned so much through your podcasts. So I'm very excited to get to talk to you about, your love of both of these, Selena and Juan Gabriel, but also just your love of reporting about it, not just keeping it to yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much, Danielle, for having me. I'm excited to be here. And yeah, let's chat music and writing about it, and inspiration.
Well, I always like to start with kind of the past pop culture influence. And so I would love to start with you kind of taking us through the moment you first realized you were like falling in love as a fan with Selena and or Juan, whoever you want to start with.
The thing is, I grew up, in West Texas, right on the US-Mexico border, and like Selena, um, knowing who Selena was here was like breathing air. Like she was everywhere. Like she was just like in the air and the atmosphere. And so I don't have like a specific moment that I remember like learning about her, but I do have a specific moment when I remember like realizing that she was different, and that like there was something really special about her. And I must have been like probably 6 or 7, and I was watching TV with my parents, and she was doing an interview, and she was speaking Spanglish, like half English, half Spanish, sprinkling words in both languages here and there. And she had a sort of like Texas drawl, and she didn't speak perfect Spanish, but she was also like so proud to be Mexican. And I remember like making a mental note of that when I was really young. And I remember noticing that it was like the first time that I saw someone like on national and like mainstream TV speak with like the same cadence and the same accent, and like the same way that my community spoke, the same way my cousins spoke, the same way that like I sounded sometimes. And it was so incredibly like impactful because I saw myself like reflected in her. And I just had never seen anything like that. And this was, in the 90s. And I think we forget we've come such a long way in terms of seeing ourselves like reflected on screen, you know.
I think we have, but I think there's still so many deficits that I was gonna ask you if you do feel that way. Like, I don't think there will ever be another Selena specifically, but like, if you're watching, if you feel like you could put yourself in that mindset for when you saw her watching today, if there's somebody that you do feel like, yeah, that's similar, that's close.
I mean, now we have so many more like examples of, you know, Latinas living authentically on screen. You know, we have Eva Longoria, which was,
Mm,
of course, contemporary of Selena, and we have so many like young, you know, pop stars and also actresses, and I think like the conversation is different. I think in the 90s we were just like starved
yeah.
for like, any representation, but especially like a positive
Mm,
representation for us, you know, because in the 90s the way that like Mexican identity and Mexican culture was portrayed in like the mainstream was, um, you know, there was a narrative of like high school dropouts or like teenage moms or like lost gangsters. And it was like very negative and
yeah.
stereotypical. And here was Selena, who was like a representation of excellence, right? Like she was so um
Well, she
yeah,
also had a, I mean, she had a talent that like not everyone's going to have. But she
yeah.
also, I think this is going to sound maybe a little strange, but like the way that she was branded, like she, they did, I think everybody on her team, and I think that's also partially because of her, did so well at not trying to put her in a box in terms of like an image, a specific and only this one thing. And I mean, I say that as somebody who like very clearly white woman, very clearly like heard her music, but didn't have the same cultural understanding that you had, or the same awakening and like desire to see like, oh, that's me represented. It's obviously different for me watching and listening to her, but being able to say that as someone who doesn't identify that way and say, hey, that is different from the other images that we're usually getting on TV or in movies or in the news, and like that I think is also very important.
But I also think like she was so like authentically American too. Like she
Mm,
was American teen, you know,
right.
and so music was like influenced by R&B and rock and heavy metal and like American rock and roll and hip hop. And so what made her so unique is that she infused all those influences into like traditional Mexican American roots music, creating like this whole new genre, right?
Mm,
And like innovating music. So, you know, she was actually like a genius at her craft and like an amazing performer. And then on top of that, like she was also sort of like bigger than just herself. Like she stood for sort of transcending and rising in sort of like mainstream American
mhm.
culture, compromising your roots, which was such a powerful message.
It's one of the things I love that you immediately said when I asked you about like what made you fall in love with her, was that you were talking about like identifying with her and seeing your culture. I want to talk now a little bit about how that translated to the music. Were you immediately a fan of her music and also Juan Gabriel's music, or like were you a fan of the music because you were a fan of who they were and what they were doing for the greater culture?
Oh no, I think their music came first for
Okay.
sure. Yeah, like you know, Selena's music was truly so innovative and like, you know, yeah, like covered new ground in a way that like caught the world by storm. Like there had never been a sound like that, something that like, you know, combined cumbia with techno and American R&B influence and sort of like border roots music and sounds and a little bit even of polka. Like it was just so truly yeah, innovative and cutting edge. And I was in love with it when I was a child. And we played it at family parties, and it was so fun. And it still is, like, it's aged so beautifully. Like and you see it with like younger generations,
Mhm.
younger girls who like were not around when she was alive, and still like the music is just speaks for itself. It's art that exists on its own, and that, yeah, has gained like a worldwide following. Same with Juan Gabriel. Like Juan
Mhm.
Gabriel, the thing with him is he was truly one of the most prolific songwriters in the entire world. I mean, he invented new genres of music. The ranchera ballad did not exist until Juan Gabriel innovated it and like birthed it into the world. And the way he wrote music was so simple, so elegant, but like so cutting. Like it I don't know, it really like encapsulates the full range of being human, sadness, spite, revenge,
Mm.
love, lust, everything. He has a song for everything. And they're also like poetic. Like his lyrics are like the most ubiquitous poetry in Latin America. And so and for US Latinos too. And so like, yeah, their music, I think, speaks for itself and comes first. But then who they are as a performer, as an
Mm.
artist, is also just like equally powerful. So like together it just creates this force of humanity.
So at what time in your life do you feel like you started looking beyond the music, beyond the performance, to like who they are as people, to get to dig deeper than like maybe that interview you saw them do on TV, or maybe like the banter in a concert?
I mean, I think almost immediately, I think like their music and their identity are so intertwined.
Mm.
Like Selena, for example, was performing sort of these pop cumbias,
Mm.
right? And that in itself is like a reflection of who she was. She was an American girl with teenage sensibilities, like a who loved, pop princesses. She was a fan of Paula Abdul and Janet Jackson, and like particularly like Black women in pop,
Mm.
always talking about Taste of Honey and how much, all of these artists really inspired her. But then there was Cumbias. She was also like a Mexican American girl next door. She was also like proud of her roots. And so the music was a reflection of their identity, and it was just so inextricably tied to who they were. And so I knew, like I said, from such a young age, like 6, 7 years
Mm.
old, um, that Selena in particular was, um, yeah, reflective of who I was. And then with Juan Gabriel is, for many people of Latin American descent, the first person who we heard people say was gay. Like, he really was the first representation of queerness in many people's lives.
Mhm.
And there was this like duality,
Mhm.
people adored him and spoke about him with reverence and admiration. And at the same time, um, he was also like a proxy uh for unleashing like a society's homophobia.
Mm.
And he was also like the butt of jokes constantly, and was ridiculed, because society just hadn't caught up to the acceptance he deserved. And so, yeah, like I knew so early on too, like when I was young, that Juan Gabriel was different, that he wasn't like other pop stars, that there was a femininity to him, that I didn't see in other, in like his equals and in Mexican
Mhm.
pop music.
Do you feel like that is a big part of why now is the right time for the podcast? Because one of the things that and you can correct me if this is not true because I read this on the internet, so maybe it's not true. But one of the things that I read was a big part of doing the story now was because you did get a lot of interest from fans of his saying like, are you going to do his story next after doing Selena's? And the reason I'm asking is not just about the timeliness of the fan interest, but also because we are at a different place in society where we can explore his sexuality and the things that people unfortunately bashed him for then with a different light now, and saying it was wrong the way that they treated him when they did that, as opposed to, maybe even 10 years ago having to take a different approach because the culture wasn't what it is today.
That's a great question. It was both. Like, one, I have always loved Juan Gabriel, as like the trailer says. Like, my mom would literally play
Yeah.
his music for me when I was in her womb. Like, I inherited a love for him from my family, and um I'd always wanted to give him his flowers for the queer icon that he was. I think there's a lot of conversation around his performances and his lyricism, which like, that is first and foremost to me,
Mhm.
like his history and his humanity. Like, I want to center that always. And I also think, he really made strides in um preparing society to accept queerness. And the progress was not tidy or linear or neat, but it was real. And I really wanted to sort of like do him justice and like
Yeah.
give him his flowers for everything he did as a queer icon, and to tell his story in sort of a more nuanced way.
Mhm.
I really craved that. And yeah, and then after I finished Selena, like, I had already started like contemplating that, and I would get messages on social media from people being like, "Oh, you gotta do a podcast on Juanga next." And yeah, so the seeds were like already being
Yeah.
planted.
I also like that, like, they said that and then that's what happened, because so many people where I have been in the last 15 years in the TV world wish that's how it worked. They were like, we want to see this on the show, and they never get to. So it's nice that at least they got what they wanted here. I think also, as you said, like, to do it with nuance, I didn't know a lot about him going in. But I also feel like listening week to week, you're uncovering a lot that I don't think a lot of people knew, like the police files and things that as a reporter you had this extra ability to not just tell his story, and as a fan not just tell his story with love, but to know how to investigate and know how to like get to truth and get to something new and exciting. And so I was hoping you could kind of walk me through, or walk us through the balance when you embarked upon the podcast that you felt like you needed to have for it to be a success, in terms of like how much your story, how much his story, how much fan love, how much something new, and then look at it standing back having finished it and feel like, are you satisfied or is there more to tell?
First and foremost, I think for me, as somebody who started off in journalism, is I wanted the investigation, the reporting, the fact finding to be incredibly sound and rigorous. Like,
Yeah.
that was my priority. And, there's been a bio series about
Mhm.
Juan Gabriel. His story is like one of the most like told and retold in Latin America. And so I knew that like I didn't want to repeat what other projects had done. Like, I wanted to really frame his story in a way that was really fresh and really revealing. And I knew that there had to be like new details and layers that like hadn't been uncovered. And I had heard rumors about like this long lost prison file, and I basically was in contact for with the Mexican National Archives for many, many months,
Mm.
from like June of one year to like when I finally went March of the next.
Mm.
So that's like 9 months.
I think that's something that gets lost a lot, is that like people think, oh, it can't be that much work when you already know and love something and you're telling a story. And I'm like, no, there's a lot that goes into all of this, especially if you want something new and you want to do it the right way.
For sure. And so, um, yeah, so we were in contact with them for like 9 months, sort of coordinating a visit, and then also like really trying to pinpoint where this lost file was.
Mm,
And we were working with them like, do we search here? Do we search there? They were searching, and then finally, it was located, and it was thanks to an amazing archivist that we worked with at the Mexican National Archives. And then, there was the rumors that I wanted to get to the bottom of, like when
mhm,
I interviewed people who were in his inner circle, and people would tell me, oh, Juan Gabriel would talk about only to his inner circle, would talk about like this terrible sexual assault that he faced at the hands of a priest
mhm.
as a teen. And I wasn't planning on publishing that because it was just sort of like hearsay. I would
Okay,
hear it um, when I'd interview people. But then I read the account in
right.
the print file, and I read, a young Juan Gabriel talking about it to a social worker. And it just really illuminated for me, just how much he transcended,
Mm.
and how he was able to reclaim joy and generosity and love despite the tremendous amount of suffering that he had faced.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think also just you use the word humanize before, and you also use the word revealing. And I think both of those in these specifics that we're talking about really exemplify that, just in the sense of like, you maybe thought you knew this person. I think there's so many people who go in as a fan of anything, and they think because they see an image, they've heard you talk a couple of times, they think they know you, and they maybe imagine what you've been through. And then to unpeel this kind of layer is, I think, very important, because I think it just helps us understand each other better. Um, I do think that also it's a little scary, both on the doing it of somebody else when he's not here to respond, but it's also scary, I would imagine, for you doing it for yourself, putting yourself in the podcast. How did you balance that? Like, how much what was the line you wanted to walk? And like, did you have someone who checked you and said, you could put more of yourself here or less of yourself here? I feel like you said you did that with Selena at one point, like you had editors that were encouraging you. How did that process change between podcasts?
Oh yeah, I mean, we had just an incredibly, yeah, rigorous and involved editing process where we had one, my main editor who read every single draft. But then we would have group edits with my team, with multiple producers and associate producers who would hear different iterations of the story as we were polishing it and would chime in. That sort of like brain trust is something that I really value in the process, like because I have blind spots, and I
Mm,
want to know how it's landing on people. When I'm writing, I'm not so much thinking about like how is this going to land on an audience,
right.
because I'm not actually like creating this uh for a specific audience in mind. Like I'm creating it for me. You know what I mean? I'm
Yeah.
creating it like for Juan Gabriel. Like I'm creating it because there's something deep inside of me that like knows this, that I have to like wrestle with this, and
Mm,
like something that I know um I have to release, and that I want to, yeah, do for Juan Gabriel. And like, what is the story that I feel like needs to exist in the world? And so, yeah, like I just sort of like write from the heart.
mhm.
But then I have, editors
Oh,
who,
I am more meant in terms of how much of you to put in if you like self edit yourself too much. and people say to you, put more of yourself in, like there's an interesting parallel here, or like people want to hear about you just as much as like now they're fans of you just as much as they're a fan of your quote unquote subject.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, there's definitely some of that. Like there were moments, for example, episode 3, which is all about how Juanga's queerness was criminalized and
Right.
how he ended up in prison a couple of times actually, simply for the reason because he looked gay and because, somebody found him in bed with a man. And so he was, yeah, criminalized. And so when I was writing that at first, I just had kind of written about Juan Gabriel, and my editor was like, I forgive me if I'm wrong here, but
Mm.
he knows me, he knows what my life is like and what I'm going through. And he's like, but I just can't help but think of, you and your partner, especially because for the last few months you've been talking about them moving to Texas and
Mm.
way things are. And the thing is, like, I had felt that during the reporting, like when I got the prison file and I saw, the way Juan Gabriel was, falsely accused of
Right.
pedophilia, which was a common tactic used to criminalize gay people when there was no evidence of any crime. And so, um, like I had drawn those parallels between the United States and the culture war against things like gender affirming care and the way
Mhm.
that queer people are framed as perverts or dangerous to children. And that was definitely on my mind. And I thought of like my own relationship, right? Because I'm you know in the process of possibly having my non-binary partner move to Texas with me, which is, one of the strongholds of the sort of anti-LGBTQ culture war when they're in very comfortable and progressive
Right.
new. And
Well, that's love though. I mean, I think that says a lot. So that you should feel good about that part of it.
yeah, yeah. But thankfully I live in a liberal like stronghold in Texas
Okay.
that doesn't see a lot of that pressure. It's a very blue city, but
Mm.
um yeah, so there were moments where, my editors and our producers would say, Maria, like I'm craving
Right.
you like making meaning of this with your own like relationship. And it was sort of like a balance, like when is it relevant, when is it authentic, and to
Mm.
me it comes down to like honesty. It's also like I just don't believe in telling a story from a place of nowhere. Like I say this all
Oh,
the time,
yeah.
you come to a story from the place in the world that you occupy and like the lens and the expertise and the blind spots that gives you. And like to me, I'm coming to Juan Gabriel's story as like a fan, as a queer woman. And I have to be honest with my audience about like the
Mhm.
stakes for me in telling this story. And like there are very real stakes. Like the podcast has come out and like now all of my relatives know I'm queer. And
Sure.
like
Yeah.
wasn't the case before it came out, so it was in a way like a sort of a coming out for me. I mean, I'm out in with everybody who interacts with me on a personal basis, but there were like plenty of, cousins and second
Mhm.
cousins, like people in like my big Mexican family and like my relatives in Mexico who had no idea. And so there were personal stakes for me, and I had to be like really honest with the audience about that.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but I would imagine maybe it gets easier over time, maybe it doesn't. Coming from the world of journalism and putting yourself in the story at all is a negotiation because reporters are not supposed to do that. Like feature writers can do that, but depending on the type of journalism you come from, you might have been trained not to, right? So like that already is something to wrap your head around. I know you did that with Selena. So now coming into the second podcast, you probably had rules for yourself about how much, how little, when and where. What do you feel like, if anything, has changed for you having done this podcast and having, as you just said, effectively come out to all of your distant relatives, the world, shared so much of your family, your son, your partner, et cetera, in this medium. for how you want to tell stories going forward? Do you feel like you always want to do it this way, where you have to have something really personal in order, like the attachment, in order to have those stakes to be that important to tell it?
Yes and no. Like, no, in the way that, like, Selena and Juan Gabriel were very specific stories
Oh,
for me.
sure.
Like they were like the two cultural figures that I was just pining to like do them justice through storytelling. And I don't think there will be another artist for me like that. Like, I don't think I will do a podcast like this
Mhm.
anymore. Those were it for me,
Okay.
I have, I think you'll learn in the podcast just like a wide range of interests. Like, I'm
Yeah.
like a super like space nerd. Like, I love to talk about, like, I'm pretty woo-woo, as you can tell in the
But that's
podcast.
what I mean. Like having that's enough sometimes, that kind of personal attachment to dive into that subject next.
Yeah. So like I want to do a podcast, for example, about dark matter, which is
Oh,
like that 95% of the universe is made up of dark matter. This matter, these what scientists believe are particles that we can't see or feel or hear, but that are like actually physically here with us. And so the
mhm.
question is like, what is this dark matter? Is it other universes? Is it,
Mm.
you see the speculation around that in like the Apple TV show
I was
Dark.
just gonna say, I was gonna ask you if you'd watched it. It's
Yeah,
consistent.
I did. I did. I loved it. Oh my God. I was so sad when it was over. Shout out to Apple TV.
I mean, they may renew it because I mean
Yeah,
they left
no,
it
I'm
pretty
sure they will.
open-ended.
Yeah, it was so good. But I want to do, I want to do something like that. Um, and so but at the same time, like I do have like a very distinct style in the way I approach the stories. Like, I don't believe in sort of sterile storytelling.
Right.
I mean, I think that's fine. It has a place in journalism, and for example, breaking news or hard
Right.
news, or for example, somebody who's covering like politics, right? Um, you want that sort of, I wouldn't say neutrality, but like that really sort of straight kind of
Yeah.
storytelling.
Like you want to know it's facts and we're sticking to facts and I don't need your like flowery language.
Yeah, exactly. I understand that for certain beats, but like
Right.
that's not, like I
No,
want
and
like
it doesn't have to be because you said it for you just said it, certain beats. Like it doesn't fit every kind of writing. It doesn't fit every kind of storytelling.
yeah, well, and I think, a good journalist is a good storyteller.
Sure.
I I do think that, even if you're covering like your local city council, which is like a beat I started in my career many, many, many years ago, like, the key to getting people to care in many cases is
Mm.
like, framing this as a story with stakes,
Mm.
with characters. And I am in love with that art form. And so yeah, I think storytelling I will never fall out of love with it. And yeah, for me, I'm always going to approach it from like a very personal perspective. And I think I always want to be honest with my audience about like my positionality in the story, like where I
Right.
stand, what my stakes are. And I'm drawn to work that feels personal to me. And even like the stuff around dark matter, like that feels personal to me. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like, I don't want to tell a story the way a scientist would want us to tell a story. Like, I want to tell a story the way like a culture writer who's interested in sort of like what it all means.
I want to go backwards for a little minute because we're talking about storytelling and talking about how personal all these things are, to go back to when you were, as you said earlier, like 6, 7 years old, falling in love with these people as artists and as people. At, at that point, I'm imagining you're not thinking about following their career, telling their stories, years in the future. But I am curious if at that point you were thinking about what they meant to you on a larger level in terms of what you wanted to do with your life. Like, did you toy with the idea of following in their footsteps? Did you toy with the idea of, maybe even learning more about music in general from a studious perspective or from an investigation perspective because of your love for them?
Oh yeah, especially Selena. Juan Gabriel, that's a more recent one, because when I moved back to the border, I was thinking a lot about like how to live
Mm,
authentic with my family, but I was also thinking a lot about intergenerational connectedness. I was focusing a lot on like making sure my son and my mom had a very like real, yeah, relationship, really strong relationship. And so I was thinking like, how do I, hold on to my roots, hold on to my
mm,
identity, but also like live openly and authentically with my family as like the very openly queer woman that I am. And so he served as a guide for that in this very recent chapter of my life. And I would say Selena was more like throughout my adolescence, my childhood, my adolescence, my young adulthood. I thought about her a lot, like
mm,
a lot. I talk about how when I went to grad school at Columbia, and I was sort of like navigating the Ivy League scene, like I would wear her t-shirt, to sort of like remind myself of who I am and where I come from and what I can do. Um, when I was homesick, I would watch her
mm.
concerts. Like she's always been a source of inspiration in every period of my life, to sort of remind myself to fill my cup and like remind
Mm.
myself, like, you know, I can do hard things.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and we're, obviously because both of them are no longer with us. And interestingly, and maybe this was on purpose, but the timing of your finale episode um is just like 2 weeks before the anniversary of Wonka's death, correct?
It is,
Is
yeah.
so do you think about the legacy that you've helped them leave with these podcasts at all? Is there anything that you feel like by adding your telling of their story to their story has shifted for you personally or just in a larger capacity?
That's a great question. I do think about that a lot. I always say that my work, um, to me is like sort of like my offering at their
Mm,
altar. I'm not saying that it's sort of like, and I'm so flattered and grateful, and encouraged when I hear people say, like, oh my God, your podcasts are like, the record that people
mm,
should about these artists, because like you really frame them with a lot of nuance and in a way that hasn't been done. And to me, that's so encouraging and affirming, and I love that. But I didn't really like seek out to make that kind of like
yeah.
authoritative work. I mean, I'm so grateful that it's considered that in a way, but I just set out to like put my little offering on their altar and say like, this is my contribution to your legacy. Like these are my flowers. Like,
Mhm.
um, and so that's what I set out to do.
Yeah. What do you feel like was the most complicated piece of that? Like whether it's I don't actually want to say whether or because I don't want to put any words in your mouth, but in terms of like the way you're telling the story, the pieces you're including, the pieces maybe you're not including, or that maybe just something that is personally hard for you to quote unquote get through as you're telling it because it's an emotional moment for you personally or emotional in the realization as we talked about earlier as to like what this person has been through.
I mean, I think for me, the hardest moment, and I think it's different for each podcast, Selena and Juanga, but for Juan Gabriel was for sure, obviously, was his sexual assault,
Right.
and how I wrestled with whether to make that public, because he hadn't,
Mhm.
and he was a victim, and I spoke with a lot of journalists. I sought a lot of advice. I thought about the ethics of it. Um, and ultimately, I decided to publish it. It felt, journalistically like
Right.
the right thing to do. Um, but it was difficult for that reason in and of itself, but it was the most difficult because there were so many parallels in Juan Gabriel's story to the very difficult and traumatic childhood my mother had at the hands of her own mother. She was also around the same age as Juanga when she was sexually assaulted. She also lived in Ciudad Juarez like Juanga did. And she also suffered the assault, just like Juanga did, as a, you know, result of, her mother rejecting her and not providing the protection that she deserved, as was the same situation with Juan Gabriel. And so the grief around that was really difficult to navigate because here was this really personal secret that I had carried for so long. Like I say this in the podcast, like my brother found this out through the podcast. Like the night before, a few days before it came out, like my mother texted him and was like, I
Mm,
have this about me, but and part of that is because she felt so much shame, which was she never had to feel shame. She was a victim.
right.
And, and but for so long, because I think of the way she was treated afterward and before, she felt like it was somehow her fault, which it wasn't. And that's very common among, victims of young victims of sexual
Yeah.
assault. And yeah, like writing that and navigating through like the grief, but also the intense liberation of like setting that free, like saying like,
Mhm.
or this, like no more, no more, carrying this, no more thinking like it's just my burden to carry. Like
Mm,
also, my mom saying like no more shame,
yeah.
like let's release this, was so incredibly cathartic. But it was also, before we got to the cathartic part of it, it was difficult, it was
Oh, yeah.
hard. Had group edits where, it's a table read with
Oh,
multiple
wow.
people and producers and editors like hearing the episode, and here I am like in tears, like sobbing, telling this really difficult story secret that I had held for so long, and that was really hard, but I also think it was necessary and honest for the story.
I mean, imagine if you didn't get to a place of catharsis, you wouldn't have left it in. Like if it was just hard the whole time, I think you probably would have said, you know what, this isn't right, and we don't need
Yeah.
to put ourselves through this.
Yes, absolutely. And also, if it was also just like, oh my God, just like a big sad trauma dump,
Mm,
and like it was just that, like I wouldn't have done it. But
yeah.
it's also like a story of joy and resilience and love, and the fact that like yes, Juanga and my mom went through something really difficult, but they also like transcended to be these like exuberant, joyful, like um yeah, vivacious people to be around. And that to me was the big takeaway of the story. And the fact that like it's not just like, oh my God, this is a really sad story, but like, ultimately like this is a story of perseverance and yeah, and strength and joy.
Well, I mean, I think that also, you said it already, and I was going to say it as like a tout to your podcast, but the fact that there is so much joy in it, I think, going in, I think a lot of people probably would have leaned hard on the trauma because like that is what gets clicks a lot of times and it's voyeuristic, but to be able to not only balance it, but kind of go above and beyond it and say, wait a minute, there's so much to celebrate here, and to constantly remind everybody of all of the achievements, like the talking about that concert at the Rose Bowl and like what he went through to have it happen at all. But I imagine to everybody who you were speaking to who were there or had watched it in some form, it's taking them back to a place in their life. Similarly to the way that you're connecting your story to his story, like they're doing that. It's nostalgic. It's what I remember, why I connected, why I love this. So before I let you leave us, I want to ask you to do that for all of our audience and pick your favorite child, pick your favorite album maybe or song that you want to leave with the audience to explore, both for Selena and Juan Gabriel, to kind of say like, this is why I love them so much. I had to tell their stories, get to know them through this.
Ooh, I love that question. So,
That's usually the hardest question for everybody. Nobody likes picking their favorite anything, and
yeah,
everybody's brain just explodes with like, I can't even remember the titles anymore.
yeah, it is sort of a daunting question. But if I had to pick like the one song or like the one moment or anecdote about Juan Gabriel, it would be there's a song called El Noa Noa Dos. And if you've listened to the podcast, I mention it. But Juan Gabriel had this very, very famous song called El Noa Noa. So this is not to be confused with that. This is El Noa Noa Dos. Noa Noa number two. Um, and El Noa Noa was a very famous nightclub in Ciudad Juarez. So Ciudad Juarez, for a long time, I think it's like an understatement to say it was like the Las Vegas or the Atlantic City of um, the Southwest. It was glitzy and glamorous, but also kind of gritty and, edgy. And nightclubs were open all night, like 24/7, literally. And, in the 50s, you had people like Marilyn Monroe and Elizabeth Taylor who partied there, got divorced there, married there. It was just like this very sort of like liberal, open-minded, bohemian nighttime city. And in the middle of it all was this very iconic club called El Noa Noa. My mom went there. It burned down in the 90s, unfortunately, but it was so iconic for a long time. And the thing about Juan Gabriel is he was also, he was born in central Mexico, but he was raised in Ciudad Juarez. He was from
Mm,
the border. So he also had a lot of American influence in his music. And at that time, country western was big as it still is now, but it was sort of like a very specific like 1970s, um yeah, like twangy lo-fi guitar country western type of thing. And he combined it with disco
mm,
because Juarez was big on disco as well at that moment, and it creates this really fascinating song called El Noa Noa Dos, which is this amalgamation of sounds, American and Mexican,
mm,
um, and I mentioned in the podcast, but the lyrics are basically about being like young and free in Ciudad Juarez at night, like going clubbing, seeing somebody from across the room, giving them like sexy club eyes, meeting them, dancing all night. And it's a song about youthfulness
mm.
and liberty and fun, and it's so catchy and so fun, and I really 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 recommend it.
Nice. You want to do one for Selena too? Just
Yeah,
one.
with Selena, I really recommend I'm Getting Used to You.
Mm,
It's one of her English songs, and it's just like an example of like, to me she was already such a like pop princess, but the big narrative around her is like, oh my God, she was about to cross over into the English US market. And this is an example of like the direction she was heading in, a sort of like smooth
mm,
R&B, like pop princess sound, and like her vocals are so silky in it, and it's like, it's like a sort of like not a dance number, but it's sort of like a sexy, like loungy, like groovy song.
mhm.
And yeah, it's just it's I love it. It's really catchy, and it's like pop Selena at her best.
Yeah. Maybe also makes you think of like where it could have gone, which I think is hopeful, but also a little sad because we never got that. So now I've left us all on a down note. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. It was a pleasure to chat with you. And everybody at home, if you're listening to this podcast, go listen to Maria's podcasts. You can find them on Apple, just like this one. So anything for Selena, my Divo.
Oh, Danielle, thank you so much for having me. It's been such a pleasure. Thank you for such thoughtful questions.
Of course.